Fusion Retro Books produce an outstanding bi-monthly magazine in the form of Fusion, a stunning mix of retro and modern gaming delivered to your door and filled with articles to take you on a nostalgic trip while keeping you up to date with modern gaming, because old or new, good games are just good games, right? And now announcing the Fusion 2020 annual Kickstarter, because it's not a real gaming mag until it gets its own glossy annual, is it now? Find out more at fusiongamemag.com. Our guest today is a video game designer who worked for a company that oozed quality. It was top of its class in multiple genres, and it gave us, or at least it gave me, the affirmation that the hundreds or thousands of pounds that I'd spent on my new PC was money well spent when I fired up, I think it was Day of the Tentacle, so there was definitely no buyer's remorse there for me. The company is, of course, LucasArts, and the man is David Fox. Welcome, David.
Hey there.
David, I understand that when you joined LucasArts, it wasn't even called LucasArts at this time. We're going way, way back in the company's history. So when did you join them?
Well, I joined right at the very beginning when it was the games group within the computer division of Lucasfilm. And I was the third person hired for this, maybe the second outside person. One person transferred from inside the computer division over. So that was 1982. September 82 is when I started.
Mm-hmm. And whereabouts in the world was this all happening? Where were you based?
So this was in Marin County, California, which is just north of the Golden Gate Bridge and north of San Francisco, which is where Lucasfilm was based. And I happened to actually live in that same county, so that was convenient and have to relocate or anything.
Yeah, and I understand also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was off the back of a book that you wrote about computer animation, or you were writing, that got the attention of Lucasfilm. Was that your in?
Yes. Well, it wasn't that it got their attention. It was that I grabbed them by the shoulders. A year earlier, when I was working on the book, I had a section on the book on, well, half of the book was programming for the Atari 800 to do animation, and the first half was really looking at animation in general, computer animation in general, and looking at what state of the art at the time was for computer animation. And of course, for that, I went to Lucasfilm Computer Division, which was starting to do some really interesting stuff with animation for film. Like, I think the first big thing they did was a piece for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which was the Genesis transformation of the planet, or a planet was terraformed. So I contacted them, told them I was researching this for the book, and they were very welcoming, and ended up hanging out with them, having some meetings with them. Alvy Ray Smith, who was one of the co-founders of the computer division and later of Pixar, offered to proofread the book when it was done for technical accuracy. And we went to SIGGRAPH, and I hung out with Lauren Carpenter, who was one of the guy who pretty much came up with flying through fractal landscapes. And I then, so it was a nice connection. So a year later, I heard from a member of a computer center that my wife and I were running, a public access computer center, told me that they were starting up this new group. So I immediately contacted them and was able to get a interview. One of the first people who were interviewed for a position.
And the computer center you mentioned, I think that goes back to 1977, I think it was. So you had a long-term interest in computing. But on the animation side, did you have an interest in more traditional animation before you then transferred to applying it to computers?
Yeah, not as an animator, because I didn't have that skill set. But when I was a kid, I was living in Los Angeles, not too far away from where the Hanna-Barbera studios were located. And you could just ride my bicycle out to the studio. We had a huge dumpster in the back, and I go dumpster diving, come back up with armfuls of cells from the Flintstone cartoons, and put them in a box and carted them back home. And then I had a 8mm camera, or movie camera, which could do single frame animation or single frame stepping, and would reassemble the sequences and put them in a different background, and just experiment with that to see what it's like. And I remember doing stop motion video stuff. Like we would assemble a jigsaw puzzle, and then I would go backwards. So slowly taking piece by piece out and animating the pieces as if they were finding their way in, and then later ran the whole thing backwards so it looked like the puzzle was assembling itself. And stop motion of the sun, time-lapse photography of the sun rising, and shoes walking by themselves, and just so I was just really interested in that kind of stuff as a kid, but not hand-drawn stuff. So there is definitely a thread that you could follow.
Now, you were employee number three at LucasArts. At this point, it's a whole new division for Lucas. Did it have a clear objective, or did it feel more like a kind of a skunk works sort of project there? What was it like?
I'd say it was kind of a weird hybrid. Atari actually gave Lucasfilm $1 million to help start the group, and then they got the first right of refusal for any games we did. Of course, we had to do games for the Atari first, which is why our first games came out on that platform. George, I believe, saw computer games more as a continuum of something that was going to continue to improve. He wanted to just get his feet wet, not him personally, but to have the company start working on those. He wasn't really a gamer. He visited us a few times over the years, but at least during the time I was there, he really wasn't very involved with what we were doing. More like he was aware and he's protective of us. We were, part of a larger company that was very profitable. So we didn't have that same pressure of, you better create hits or you're going to go out of business. And we knew that we could be much more innovative. The first two games we worked on, Rescue on Fractalus, which I ended up working with Lauren Carpenter with, that's the flight game through Fractal Mountains, and Ballblazer, were intended more as experimental games. We did them as a project, or we called them throwaway games, where if they didn't work out well, we could just toss them. So the pressure of trying to have a Star Wars hit level on our first go was kind of removed, which helped a lot. That was a lot to live up to like, okay, we're the people expecting the Star Wars of computer games or video games at the time, was very intimidating. So that helped relieve the pressure. And I never felt at that time that we had to work for creating hits. We weren't allowed to do Star Wars titles for the first at least 8 years, maybe 9 or 10 years. Definitely not when I was there.
Yeah. The first title you worked on, you mentioned there was Rescue on Fractalus.
That was mine, but I wanted to be a Star Wars game and found out that we weren't allowed to because the license had already been sold to other companies.
I bet everyone must have sat down and cracked their knuckles on day one and thought, right, Star Wars, here we go.
Of course, yeah. Well, that was why I joined the company. It was because I wanted to get into the movie somehow. And I saw Star Wars in 1977, which was the same year we launched our computer center, and just was enthralled by it. And said, hey, I want to live in that universe in some way. And working for the company was as close as I could get. And then finding out that now I couldn't even create a game in that universe was very disappointing. I learned that the first day I arrived.
But I mean, what you created with Rescue on Fractalus was a really impressive game. At that time, I would have been playing games like Mercenary, in a similar kind of vein, flying around in a spaceship. But that was purely wireframe graphics. It didn't have the detailed filled canyons and mountains that you had. Was this the first example of that kind of tech in a game that you know of? Yeah,
it was. And it kind of came about because I was office mates with Lauren Carpenter for the first few months while they were getting our space ready. And that was one of the first questions I asked him was, is it possible to do a fractal game on a 8-bit computer? And he kind of laughed derisively at first, said no, and then started thinking about it and took it as a challenge and came back soon after and said, there might be a way to do it. So we loaned him an Atari 800. He took home on his free time and taught himself the innards of the machine and as well as 6502 assembly, and came back literally, I think it was like 3 days with a working demo. And it was a demo of there were no flight dynamics of just like you move forward or back through a terrain, and frame rate was decent. It was like at least 7 or 8, maybe 9 frames per second because there weren't a lot of extra overlap things on top of it. And so, wow, okay, we can do it.
Yeah, we've got a game. You must have thought that immediately.
We've got a game, yeah.
Yeah. We recently spoke to a chap called Mike Daly. He was the man at DMA Design behind the tech demos that turned into Lemmings and also Grand Theft Auto. And he explained to us from his experience in the 80s and in the early 90s, pretty much, in fact, every game that they created was as the result of a tech demo of just playing around and seeing what happened and then saying, okay, there's a game in that. Does that ring true with what you were doing? Was there just lots and lots of tech demos?
Yes and no. So in the case of Rescue, I had this concept of I really wanted to do a game which captured the feeling of flying in a TIE fighter or X-Wing. And your point of view, first person, I was inspired by Star Raiders, which was, I thought, a great game on the Atari 800. Which we featured at our computer center. And in fact, we put it onto a large screen projector so people could play and charge, extra $1 an hour or something for that. And I just liked the first person thrill of doing that. So I knew I wanted to do a first person game. And I didn't know if the tech was possible. I knew there would be ways to do it using wireframe. But I really wanted to do something more interesting. So once we knew we could do it, then the game design matched what we could do. So it kind of was a tech demo, but it came from a concept of what I wanted to be doing. I think the other case, which was very much that, was with Ball Blazer, with Dave Levine working on Ball Blazer, where he didn't really know exactly what the game was for quite a while he was working out this split screen, very smooth motion, forward motion, side motion, using a lot of tricks to get the Atari to do that at 30 frames per second. May even been faster, may have been 60 frames per second. So it looked like video. And then the game came months after through a lot of introspection thinking and brainstorming and it finally came out of that.
Excellent. Well, moving on from Ball Blazer and from first-person X-Wing flying or pseudo X-Wing flying, if LucasArts are remembered for one genre, it is, of course, the point-and-click adventure game. I need to show you this, David. Actually, I'm just going to change the camera view just to show you. My walls are covered in LucasArts video game covers.
Yeah.
Big fan. Now, until the next game, in fact, I think the next game, Labyrinth, LucasArts weren't yet publishing their own titles, were they? This was still being published through other companies. And many people think that Maniac Mansion is the first adventure game from LucasArts, but it was in fact Labyrinth in 1986, Correct. The game of the film. And you did work on this one, didn't you? Yes.
So this was the first opportunity to do a game based on a movie, and I think and it was a Lucasfilm was the producer of this, even though it was a Jim Henson production. I guess they thought if we could do this, then maybe they, somewhere down the line they would trust us with another property from Lucas. So we were shown early clips of the movie. I think we got a script and were asked if we were interested in doing it. And I said, yeah, definitely. This sounds like a great opportunity. And we ended up, a team of us flew to London for a week to do brainstorming, and Douglas Adams joined in, even though he had nothing to do with the film. He was a friend of Jim Henson, so he participated in all of our brainstorming sessions, and that I was super intimidated. I think I was more intimidated with him in the room.
You must have been over the point of being starstruck at this point. You must have been surrounded by stars. Yeah, you
think. Well, George was very low key and very quiet, so it was kind of intimidating, but I didn't feel like I had to keep up with him. Douglas Adams' wit and his outflow of content was so enormous that I felt like I was like my mouth agape in a hurricane or something of ideas, and I of course I had read his books, so I already knew what he had done, and it was difficult to just work as a kind of as a peer with him. So I was like mostly taking notes and throwing in comments every once in a while, but I don't think I made a whole bunch of contributions. Of course, since I was taking the notes, I could add my contributions right there if I needed to, without having to blurt them out and get in between the flow of ideas. But that was great. But he was wonderful. He was charming and very, there no affect. I mean, he wasn't like, I am Douglas Adams. He was just like a real regular person who just happened to be brilliant and funny.
Wonderful. Now, when we look at the game Labyrinth, there are similarities between that and then the later Maniac Mansion. Is Labyrinth, is that the root of the SCUM system that's used in LucasArts games, or are we not quite there yet?
No, Labyrinth was all done straight assembly, 6502 assembly, which made it very painful to put together. But there were routines that Charlie Kellner created that got reused, like I think the cell animation routines, some of the audio routines, and a bunch of that was reused. But the actual SCUM engine, Ron did that from scratch pretty much.
Right, yeah, because the SCUM games appeared on a lot of different platforms, so it must have to be been built with portability in mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, he actually started doing Maniac Mansion in 6502. Realized really soon that with all the interactivity he wanted to put into it, that it would just be impossible. So that's when he was talking with Chip Morningstar, another member of the group who was known for working on Habitat, which is the first massively multiplayer game that was created, and came up with the idea of using interpretive code, P code, and so we could easily transport to other platforms, but also we could write the scripts in almost English, and then have them converted before they went down to the computer. And that made it much easier to do. I think I was the first, after Ron invented it, I was the first person to actually script in SCUM and, on Maniac Mansion. And for the first beta tester for sure, because I was working on a language that was still being created. Often I'd be spending a lot of time trying to figure out whether I was just stupid and, the coding was my error, or whether there was actually a bug in the language, and I had to come up with examples that proved that wasn't me. So that made it take a little bit longer, but, I loved working it, which is why the next game I did, which was Zak McKracken, also used SCUM.
Yes, and Zak McKracken, you were the project lead on, I believe.
Right.
Whereas Maniac Mansion, you came in a little bit later in the process.
Right. So Labyrinth, so Rescue and Labyrinth, I was the project leader and say the designer. And Maniac Mansion, I came in onto Ron Gilbert and Gary Winnick's project. They had already pretty much had the design done, and was the SCUM scripter. And then Zak was back to me again, and I brought in Matthew Kane to help me with the scripting.
So up until now, I mean, you've got these two games under your belt using SCUM. Sierra had been a dominant force in the genre with games like their King's Quest series. Were there certain lessons that you were learning from the competition, or on how or how not to approach this genre, or were you just focused on what you were doing?
For Labyrinth, I would say not. I mean, in Labyrinth, we actually talked about creating a text parser, but the schedule was so tight that we realized there's no way we could come up with a really good one. So instead of doing that, we ended up with this kind of a slot machine verb object interface where you have a scrolling set of verbs and objects you could create sentences from. So it was a precursor to Scum, where everything was pretty much there on the screen. But it was in that same direction. In the case of Scum, Ron was clear that he didn't want to do parser, and in fact felt that having to, in his term, guess the parser was kind of metagaming, and you really weren't sure what the programmer had called the object. Was it a shrub or a bush or a plant or what?
Or for us, we were dealing with Americanisms and American spellings, so we were trying to figure out what the word was. Yeah,
right. And the other downside for their system was that it made translation much more difficult. So I don't know if they even translated to other languages. Where with Scum, the other than the text for the people who are spoken, there were only a small subset of verbs you had to translate, and the object names that made it much easier. So in the States, they probably sold 10 times as many games for each game that we did. But in Europe, I don't think they had any penetration other than the English versions. So we started translating and ended up filling this gap that they didn't have. So we ended up becoming much more prominent there. And even now, I think more on a per capita basis, way more popular in Europe.
I think perhaps that also has something to do with the humor that was injected into Lucasfilm's games that perhaps wasn't there quite so much in a game like, say, Police Quest, which was super serious. I think over in Europe, that humor translated quite well.
That's good. Yeah. And for Zak, especially in Germany, it was a huge hit compared to, say, in the States. And so much so that there were several fan-created sequels or prequels that were put together over mostly in the 1990s. And I don't know if that happened with any of the other games, because they just wanted to continue creating that universe, which was, kind of an honor. I didn't play any of them myself because I felt like I didn't want to, if there ever were to be a sequel or any other project, I didn't want to have been influenced by someone else's work and then be worried that I might unconsciously pull from someone else's ideas. So I think we felt like we were competing with Sierra here, and they must have been competing with us in Europe. And it was kind of a nice switch around.
Well, the next game that we come on to then is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Unless I'm missing anything, there wasn't anything in between, was there, Zak? And
correct.
Indiana Jones.
Yeah. In terms of stuff that I worked on, that's accurate. In terms of Scum, there's Loom, which was also using Scum. Brian Moriarty did that, and yes, and so I believe I'm not sure when the release date was. It might have been a year after Indy, so it might have been in production at the same time we were working on Indy.
I've got 1990 on the box, I'm seeing.
Right, and Indy came out in 89. So this is the 30th anniversary of Last Crusade.
Yeah. And this was obviously a movie tie-in, but you were on quite a tight time limit with this one, and I think 3 designers were brought into the mix. So how did that play out? Did you enjoy that experience?
It was really good. Noah Falstein was initially the project leader on this, and he was kind of struggling with it, I think, trying to figure out how he's going to pull it off before the film's out. This was like maybe November before the film was released in June of the following year. And, he talked to our general manager, Steve Arnold, and we ended up bringing myself and Ron Gilbert in. So the 3 of us kind of became co-equal project leaders and designers and split up the game and worked together. and we're able to pull it off. And we didn't quite hit the release of the movie, but I think we launched maybe a couple months after it came out. But that was still close enough, considering we hit most of the summer, all the summer, and the film was going to be in the theaters for the whole summer, so it wasn't a huge issue.
What was George Lucas's attitude towards this game? Was he watching you a little more closely, being the movie tie-in, or did he still give you some creative freedom?
Well, we had a meeting with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg at the very beginning of the project to ask them what the parameters were. What could we do? Could we kill Indy? Could we go outside the script and the story and the locations? And they pretty much said, yeah, you do whatever you want. Kill Indy, go to South America if you want to, go anywhere you want. And, they just gave us as much leeway as we needed. We knew we knew the character. This is the third movie. We knew what he was like, so we didn't have to do a lot of character building for the game. We had a story. So the challenge was more a combination of timing and how do you create a game. Same thing for Labyrinth. How do you create a game that works well for anyone who has or has not seen the film? Although in this case, we assumed pretty much everyone would have seen the film. We couldn't take that for granted, and we couldn't use solutions from the film as spoilers with the game, although the general story kind of followed along. So that was, that worked. And we also realized that being an Indiana Jones movie or game, there had to be some sort of action sequence. If it was all just problem solving, it wouldn't feel accurate.
Yeah, I remember being surprised actually when I first played it, and you get into the boxing ring to do some training, don't you? Mm-hmm. I wasn't expecting this in a point and click adventure.
So in the boxing ring, we also had you're flying the biplane, which was a scene from the movie, and we felt you had to have some action. There were a bunch of action sequences in the movie that we just couldn't afford to do in terms of time. Like there's a whole sequence in Venice, and the Venice canals and boats, and a boat chase and explosions and all that. And that just, was totally missed. We just skipped that whole thing.
Yeah. So the collaborative designer's effort then, it worked pretty well. It worked well from my point of view as a player. I really enjoyed the game. But you did have to mediate, I understand, for the game ending.
Yeah, so well, mostly through the whole thing, we worked well together. But at the very end of the project, there was a sequence. It was pretty much the end game sequence, the very last part, which I was doing the scripting for. I was coding it, and Ron gave me the dialogue for it, which is a very irreverent, tongue-in-cheek version of it. And I went ahead and put that in just to get it working. And the note comes up to me and says, okay, here's the final dialogue for the sequence. And I said, well, I have Ron's already coded. And we ended up having to have a meeting, the three of us, to figure out, which version. Was it going to be Noah's more straightforward, authentic dialogue, more from the movie, or Ron's irreverent version? And they both were insistent that theirs is the one that should be. So my solution was to use a random number generator and switch between the two versions in each segment. So we ended up having both of them in there, and depending on which way the random numbers go, you will play with one or the other. Or I think it may have been several points where I make the choice between the two rather than the entire stream.
I love it. It's a real programmer's solution to a problem.
Yeah, right. And of course, they all checked my random number code to make sure that it wasn't just for the first 3 months or something. That it would.
Oh, there's no bias. You weren't favoring anyone.
Right.
Well, LucasArts would fill the 90s with many more memorable point-and-click adventure games before succumbing to first-person shooters and all the other genres that became popular. But what happened for you next? You did do a few more Lucas games, didn't you? I think you worked on Pipe Dream, was it? I
worked on Pipe Dream more as a producer, since that was a game that I think we purchased or licensed from another company, small group, and we managed the conversion. So I think I was managing the conversion to the Mac, and we also did some adjustments to the gameplay, but it was much more of a management role than a creative programming role. And then I spent a year as the director of operations. We were growing rapidly as a group. 15 of us moved to, there was 3 of us when I started, 15 of us when we moved to Skywalker Ranch. And then 4 years later, we were around 65 and outgrowing the ranch. We had to move back to a commercial area in San Rafael in Marin County. And we saw it continue to grow, but it was a very flat organization. Everyone was pretty much had to report to Steve Arnold, our general manager. So he wanted to create more heads of groups, heads of departments. And he asked me to come, to take on this role, pure management role for a year to bring in people to head these different groups. And not a really fun prospect for me because it wasn't creative in the same. I had to make creative decision making, I guess, but it wasn't creative in the way that you would be creating a game. And but as a carrot, he knew that I really wanted to be doing immersive entertainment, like location-based entertainment or theme park related stuff. And he said, "Okay, we're gonna do it. If you do this for a year, then I'll promise you we'll have a project that we'll create where you can do work on your dream." And that's what happened. So after a year of doing this, I got to work. We created a small group. I wasn't the head of the group. I was, I guess, the lead creative on it, called Rebel Arts and Technology, and it was kind of skunk works. And we had a partnership with Hughes Simulations, Hughes Aircraft, and we ended up creating so we called the Mirage Project. It was a very large pod, 2 seats inside for 2 players, and it was going to be networked with maybe 7 other of these pods. We used an Amiga for a heads-down display and for the joystick controls, and it was awesome game. It was actually a Star Wars game, and so it was my first Star Wars game I got to work on. And
it sounds like the ultimate Star Wars game. To be honest, I'd love to play that. Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of gameplay, it was very much, I was kind of reusing some of the rescue on Fractalus because we were really flying through terrain, through mountainous terrain, but at 60 frames per second with 120 degree field of view where you can looking around and seeing the whole thing. So very, very immersive. And it was great, but it was too expensive. The tech at the time we were using, professional flight simulator technology. It's probably going to be about $1 million per pod. So maybe $6 to $8 million for a setup, and they just couldn't sell the concept at theme parks.
Yeah.
So
what could you charge to go on that? $1, $5 a go? It's
yeah, really
lot of rides to make that money back. Yeah.
Well, so I guess we're doing that now with the Star Wars scene area in Disneyland. So they can now do it much more cost effectively.
So just thinking about your whole time then while working at LucasArts, what period was your favorite, David? Was it when you were at the Skywalker Ranch, or what was the best point for you, do you think?
When I was at Skywalker, Maniac Mansion, Zak McKracken, and Indiana Jones all took place there. And it's probably my favorite ones. Zak might have been my favorite just because it was my concept.
Yeah, that was your baby. But it wouldn't be the end of point and click for you, because we bring you up to date to 2017, and the band gets back together. There's the T-shirt for Thimbleweed Park, which was successfully crowdfunded. You raised $626,000. Were you surprised by the thirst for an old school point and click adventure game?
No, I don't think so. I knew Ron Gilbert had a huge Twitter following at the time. And so I knew that people loved the Monkey Island games. That we were constantly being asked to do sequels or to, get the rights back from Disney. to do new ones. And this was Ron wanted to do something original. And this was his project. So he and Gary Winnick also came up with this. And I really wasn't very involved during the whole first part. I got to look at the Kickstarter pages ahead of time to give feedback, but I wasn't on the creative end of it. But once they reached I think their target was $350,000. Once they reached that and saw they were going to go beyond it, then I was invited in. I mean, I made sure he knew that I would be interested in working on it.
I'm available.
Yes. Hey, if it's possible, I'd love to work on it. And Mark Ferrari at the same time came on, who's a fabulous artist who did a lot of the backgrounds for Thimbleweed Park.
Yeah, it's got such a great look to it. It just looks like all of those classic LucasArts games. It's fantastic. And it is on sale now, I believe, for multiple platforms. So I'll put links to that. And there's another game that you worked on for tablets. Is that still on sale? I think this is back in 2014, isn't it?
Yeah, it's still available. So this is before Thimbleweed Park. I wanted to do a game. I hadn't really done games for a while. I wanted to do a tablet-based game. And I also wanted to do something which was kind of a chain reaction puzzler type game. Very much like some of the Rube Goldberg machine type games I had seen. And when I started doing the research, I saw that there weren't any games that were actually officially Rube Goldberg sanctioned. And Rube Goldberg, for those who don't know, was an American cartoonist mostly from the last century, especially popular in the 1930s and 40s. And known still for creating these chain reaction machines as cartoons. And, where we still have these, you see them all the time now, where you have one object trigger another object, triggering another object.
Yeah, the most complex solution possible to a problem, yeah.
And intent is usually, to be a comedy, to be funny. And most of the games I saw weren't, they were more puzzlers, but they weren't humorous. So I found that I found a website for RubeGoldberg.com and I contacted them and pitched my idea and got a phone call the next morning. It turned out from Rube Goldberg's granddaughter. And we had a great relationship right from the start, and got the rights to use a bunch of his original comics as the basis for the levels of the game. But, so it has a 1930s style to it in terms of music and in terms of the art direction. And it's fun.
Well, David, I think that brings us up to date on your life in gaming. So thank you very much for your contribution to the games that we know and love. David, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
If you enjoy my content and would like to toss a coin into the hat to support the cave, then check out patreon.com/retromancave and join the official cave dwellers you can see on the screen now. Thank you for your support.